Shabbat Shalom, everybody. As weird as it felt delivering last week's sermon in an empty chapel, it feels even weirder delivering it this week from my daughter's nursery. Amidst the craziness that is the Dorsch household these days, and really all of our lives at this point, Ziva's room is amongst the calmest, most serene, and quiet places we have left in our house. An added bonus is that it has somewhat of a decent Wi-Fi connection, but I have more or less transformed it into my home office for the foreseeable future. Now, for this Shabbat, I wanted to focus my remarks on the very first word of our Torah portion, the very first word in the book of Vayikra, and the very first verse. And I wanted to share with you a few insights on this verse and on this word, and the way in which it has been interpreted that I think can help us better appreciate our relationship with one another and with God during this somewhat chaotic time in our lives. Our parsha begins, Vayikra el Moshe v'yidaber Adonai elav me'el hamoed lemor, that the Lord called out to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. Now, at first glance, there's nothing particularly special about this verse. God talks to Moses fairly often throughout the entire Torah. We see it, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe. We see it hundreds of times in almost every portion. But in this portion, this is the only time in the Torah when God speaks to Moses that the Torah uses the word Vayikra, to call. And according to the commentators, that must be for a very specific reason. Now Rashi suggests that God instructed Moses to specifically use the word Vayikra here rather than Vayidaber Vayomer, because he wanted the Torah to convey the intimate personal relationship that existed between the two of them. God wanted to use the word called to demonstrate that God speaking to Moses wasn't out of necessity or circumstance, but rather out of a deep care, out of concern, and out of love. Now the Midrash compares Vayikra, Moses' encounter with God in this week's Parsha, to an encounter later on in the Torah between God and Bilam, who was sent by King Balak to curse the Israelite camp. Now, when Bilam encounters God, the text says, Vayikra Adonai et Bilam, that God happened upon Bilam. And according to the Midrash, God's relationship with Bilam was circumstantial and superficial. This was especially true when compared to God's relationship with Moses, and when comparing the two different types of encounters with God, Bilam's Vayikar and Moses' Vayikra, the only difference in the Hebrew is just one letter. It's the letter Aleph. Now this letter Aleph is obviously very, very important. It's not just in terms of how it's been interpreted by our commentators, but it's also with regards to how it is written in our Torah as well. As you can see, when it's written in a traditional Torah scroll, it's done so in a very special and specific way. The letter Aleph is incredibly small. And most biblical commentators suggest that the letter Aleph is written this way because of Moses' humility. Moses is often compared in rabbinic literature to Bilam as the two greatest prophets who had direct lines to God. Moses knew that God wanted him to use the word Vayikra to highlight their close and intimate relationship. So when Moses wrote it down, he tried to hide the Aleph by making it smaller than the other letters. Nevertheless, just the other day I came across a different interpretation, giving an alternative explanation for why the Aleph might be so small. It was offered by Rabbi Beryl Weinstein, and his interpretation really resonated with me in the way in which I am experiencing God given the craziness going on in the world around us. Now, Rabbi Weinstein essentially said that the small Aleph teaches us that when God spoke to Moses, he did so very softly. So softly that only Moses could hear God. This is similar to how Elijah at Mount Sinai finds that God is not in the strong wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, God speaks to him with a still, small voice. The small Aleph is this still, small voice. And the reminder is to us that God is often found in the small and quiet moments in life. moments that are often taken for granted, moments that we oftentimes fail to appreciate. It was a pure coincidence. It just so happened that yesterday we had what was somewhat of a minor miracle in the Dorsch household. Both of our kids happened to be napping at the exact same time. Now, it was only for about 45 minutes, but it was one of the most peaceful and quiet 45 minutes that I could remember in a long time. I just collapsed into this plush rocking chair behind me. I let out a sigh of relief, and without even really thinking about it, I said quietly to myself, thank God. Staying home, somewhat isolated from family and friends, is difficult. It can be easy to throw our arms up in the air, frustrated in anger given the status of our lives and the toll that the coronavirus has taken on us and our families. Which is why now, more so than ever, we need to Vayikra. We need to intentionally call on one another, reach out of care and out of concern. And I'm not talking about Vayikra, a hi, how are you encounter as we pass one another in the hallways of the synagogue or at the supermarket. Because let's be honest, the synagogue is closed, and fewer of us are leaving our homes on a frequent basis. We need to really make an effort to be there and support one another, and let others in our lives know that we care. And we also need to listen. We need to listen for the little Aleph. It may come in the form of a congregant, a friend, a relative who you haven't heard from in a while reaching out just to check in. Or in a beautiful, albeit short moment of peace and quiet amidst the chaos on the news or in our homes. As difficult and overwhelming as it may seem at times, I can assure you that amidst all the frustration and the craziness, the Aleph is there. We just have to open our ears and our hearts to let one another and God in. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom.